Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and today is Wednesday, December 7th, and just finished up with all of my tutoring meetings with students, and I wanted to address a topic for parents and students, but primarily for parents, because this is a theme that comes up again and again in my meetings with the kids, and I'd like to try to help parents avoid mistakes that cause them a lot of grief and confusion in their high school years with their children. When we look at the challenge of homeschooling, which is a very great challenge, a necessary challenge in our generation, but a very great challenge that none of us can really handle by ourselves. There's a conflict that is always present in the mind of Catholic parents, and we have to learn how to handle it in a practical way in space and time, in real life. Because if we don't address this problem, it causes all kinds of trouble throughout homeschooling and ultimately will cause us to be unsuccessful. Because I think if it's allowed to go on and haunt the parents, it leads them to make many bad decisions and ultimately causes them to either quit or fail in homeschooling. And what it is the pressure that's created by compulsory education, that is the legal requirement that we provide our children with a certain education. This pressure of compulsory education is artificial. It's not natural. It's nothing that anyone in history ever had to deal with. No parents had to address these legal requirements, in the Roman Empire or in the Greek period or throughout medieval history. Catholic parents never had to deal with this stuff, this mandatory legal education. Sorry, compulsory is the word. I couldn't think of it. No one ever had to deal with this until the 1850s, when public schools were invented as a social mechanism in American society, and all of this pressure was placed on parents to educate children, no matter who they were, no matter what their economic circumstances were, what their educational background was. The pressure was placed on parents that they had to provide their children with a K-12 education, either privately or they had to send their kids to a school where that education would be provided. And this is a sort of source of all kinds of self-inflicted trouble in modern society. And as Catholic parents, we have to learn how to deal with it. And it's a real conflict because there's only so many hours in a day. There's only so much time, so much energy. There's only so much money in the family budget to do these things, and yet we're challenged by our own conscience being concerned about our spiritual responsibility to do God's will, to teach our children the faith, to initiate our children into the Catholic life. And then we've got all of this artificial educational stuff thrown on top of that, and it can be overwhelming, to put it plainly. And parents often err on one side or the other, and I'd like to try to help parents avoid this error. On the one side, there are parents who just send their kids to public school. They say, oh, well, this is required by law, and the school provides this education, and it's paid for by taxes, so we're just going to stick the kids out at the bus stop in the morning and let them go off to school. And going to public school will check all the boxes, and at the end of 12 years, if the child survives, they'll get a high school diploma, and that's fine. That's one option. That's what my parents did to me. They just sent me to public school. Most Catholic parents, however, are not going to do that. They don't have an alternative. They don't know what they should do instead, but they're not going to just bust their kids into the local public school system to satisfy these compulsory education requirements. So along come the Catholic schools, and they say, hey, send them here. We'll provide that education within something of a Catholic context. And the kids will get the same high school diploma, but they'll do so within a school that's actually controlled by the church. And the church doesn't pretend that these schools are some kind of perfect manifestation of Catholic education. They're simply Catholicized public schools, and they come with a tuition bill, which adds to the burden, but that's another option. Not as extreme as the public school option for Catholic parents, but it's just one step better than the public school, and really it's intended only to serve the public school requirements, to satisfy these compulsory education requirements. On the opposite extreme, parents can choose to do it themselves, and they can choose to homeschool, which is perfectly legal, and they can satisfy these compulsory education requirements at home, and they're allowed to do so by law, which is great. Thanks be to God we can do this, but it's a very complicated business. It's, there's no homeschool parents that are free to just work on their children's education all day and all night. They've got to pay bills. There's work to do. Mothers who usually shoulder the burden of homeschooling, they've got other stuff to do. They're bearing children, they're pregnant, they're nursing kids, they've got to make meals, they've got to clean up, they've got all of these different things to do. No one is free to be a homeschooler. So homeschooling is a very great challenge, and thankfully we have resources, and there's help available for homeschooling parents, which is what I do. My tutoring work is primarily, though not exclusively, for homeschool parents, to help them to provide their children with a good Catholic education at home while satisfying these compulsory education requirements, but keeping them in their place and not allowing them to take over, which is what modern education often does. Now, the challenge that we face was talked about by Pope Pius X back in his well-known encyclical against the modernists, which is usually quoted to pick on, Novus Ordo Catholics, but that's really not what it's about. The concern that Pope Pius X expressed in that encyclical is that modern education, this secular academic world, has its own curriculum. It has its own priorities, its own agenda. And that leads to a curriculum which, again, there's only so much time, there's only so much energy, there's only so much money. And so when we add things as compulsory requirements, it takes away from that limited source of time and energy and money and so on. And that's what makes this kind of thing troublesome. Now, when we look at the modern school curriculum, we see English language studies, fine. Then we see math and science and history and foreign language. Those are the 5 basic subjects that belong to compulsory education. We look at them and we say, well, there's nothing intrinsically bad about these things, and we get to work, checking off the boxes and trying to satisfy these requirements. But there is a problem, and this is what Pope Pius X warned about. He said there's only so much time, and the danger is that these modern studies, when they're established as compulsory requirements, what they do is they crowd more lofty subjects, more sublime, more spiritual, more philosophical subjects. They crowd them out of the curriculum. And so there's no more time to read the Bible or study the catechism or learn church history or study moral philosophy or even reasoning and so on. And when we look at the modern school curricula, this is what we find. We find, let's take a Catholic school. We find a Catholic school centered around things like a gymnasium and science labs. There's no philosophy studies. The classical languages are probably not studied. No moral philosophy, likely no reasoning, no classical rhetoric or anything like that. Nothing like the ancient Catholic curriculum will be found. We'll find the school designed to serve the modern curriculum, and this is the problem with compulsory education. So when Catholic parents choose to homeschool, they've got this dilemma, right? I want to give my children, well, let's say this first. I want to satisfy the legal requirements. I want to satisfy the compulsory requirements. But at the same time, I don't want to allow these artificial compulsory education requirements to deny my children a real Christian education. I want to provide my kids with a classical Catholic education, and yet at the same time I want to check these requirements. I want to observe the law. There's nothing wrong about that, but I don't want to allow this to run wild and take over my children's education. And the truth is, the requirements are actually so little and so easy to satisfy that we can satisfy these compulsory education requirements without allowing them to run wild if we have a plan that allows us to actually do so. And most parents don't have such a plan. And this is where homeschooling gets into trouble. Some of them go nuts and they run off this unschooling, craziness where they say, like, we're going to pull our kids out of the school and sort of just do the opposite of everything that schools do. And that's just nuts, okay? Much of what modern schools do is good in terms of daily scheduling, discipline, getting the kids used to participating in a community. And so those things are good. Those are the virtues of schooling. And this unschooling is just, it's like raising savages. Like, it's just wild craziness. We want nothing to do with that stuff. So some go to that extent, and then others homeschool, and they simply give their kids a public school education at home, which again makes no sense. And I've talked about this a million times. Homeschooling gives parents the right to give their children the education that they want. But what we find is, it's easy to criticize the school. It's easy to complain and whine about how terrible everything is. But when it's time to actually formulate a positive plan and execute that plan, most Catholic parents don't know what to do. There's no way that they can manage that by themselves. Now, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, this is what we provide. We help them by showing them what the classical Catholic curriculum is and helping them to actually offer it to their children and help their children through it over the years, while also satisfying modern compulsory requirements. That's the challenge. And I would argue that the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is the only program that even pretends to undertake that twofold challenge. So we have these opposite extremes in homeschooling, the crazy unschoolers, which are just setting their kids up for misery, and we've got the opposite, which are the homeschool parents that are afraid to do anything other than the modern curriculum, where they're basically buying public school or modern Catholic K-12 books to teach at home, which again is unfortunate because it's not necessary. And so there's this difficulty finding the golden mean between just sending your kids on a bus to the public school and unschooling them at home. There's a difficulty for Catholic parents to find the golden mean, mainly because they don't know what classical Catholic education actually consists of. And again, it's easy to complain and pick apart what other people are doing, but it's very difficult to actually establish what the curriculum should be, and then it's even more difficult to actually get the work done. Aristotle said in the Ethics that it's easy to err because there's a million different ways to be wrong, but there's only one way to be right. There's only one right answer. There's a million shades of error, but only one truth, one right answer, and that's how it is in education. Parents will often say things like, oh, there's a million ways to... No, there's not a million ways to do it. There's a million ways to do it wrong, but there's not a million ways to do it right because we're limited. We're limited in time, resources, energy. Parents don't necessarily know all that they need to know to help their children. We're limited, and our limitations limit the number of options that truly exist and can be considered realistic or sustainable. Now, the secret to this, or the key to this, I don't want to say secret, the key to this is just keeping things in their place. And I think a good principle to keep in mind is Jesus says to us, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. He doesn't say, tell Caesar to go take a hike. He says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. That's a simple principle to understand how to deal with compulsory requirements. He doesn't support the crazy unschoolers and their, revolution against government that's foolishness. And they don't do anything anyway. They just make a lot of noise and then they sort of dissipate into thin air. That's nonsense. We are to give to Caesar what is Caesar's. We are to obey the laws of our country. That's part of what it means to be an ethical person, is to be patriotic and obey the state that's established by God to govern us. We have to give to Caesar what is Caesar's. But Caesar provides us with a checklist. And the checklist is very simple. And we can easily give to Caesar what he asks of us, but it makes no sense to give him more than he asks of us. And what most schools do is they give Caesar way more than he asks for. And they complain about Caesar, but Caesar's not actually asking them for what they're giving. It's like taxation. The government collects income tax from all of us, but there are rules for what we pay. And let's say if I made $100,000 in a year, the government tells me that I have to pay tax, and there are rules for what has to be paid. But the government leaves me free to give the minimum tax that the law allows, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, that's not tax evasion. Tax evasion is dishonest and fraudulent, where a person's lying about what they actually owe. But the government tells us the laws of taxation and leaves it up to us to make arrangements and manage our affairs in such a way that when all is said and done, we pay the least amount of tax possible. It's one of the greatest things about the American government is that it largely rewards people who live according to Christian principles. But Caesar asks of us a relatively small amount, and we're only obligated to give Caesar that small amount. There's no extra credit for paying extra taxes, and there's no extra credit for doing more in terms of compulsory education than is actually required of us. And this is where Christian parents err, where modern schools err. They do too much. They give Caesar too much. And they blame Caesar for their own inexplicable decisions, which Caesar doesn't actually require of them. So we want to check the boxes for these requirements and be done with it. And parents often have a hard time saying that because they imagine that it's virtuous to say, we're going to exceed the standards, we're going to go above and beyond. Well, that's great if we're talking about the real standards of education, but that's not great if we're talking about the secular educational requirements, because there's no merit in going beyond them. So the key is to understand what's actually required of you and provide that and stop there and devote all of the rest of your time and energy and resources to real goals and objectives in Catholic education, real classical Catholic education. Now, the easiest way to do that is to study with us in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, because we already provide for that. I've already done the work of showing students what's actually required of them for grade level studies. We don't need to have parents figure that all out for themselves. It's very simple. And we've provided the positive curriculum that students should actually study, which, again, other programs, though they may complain about modern education, they don't provide the positive alternative. We do. So the problem that I see with students is that they'll sign up for a class like, let's say, modern algebra, which is required as part of compulsory education laws. Okay, algebra is, let's say, a ninth grade high school math course. But what's actually required? Perfect scores on all the exams are not required. The completion of, the entire book is not required. What's actually required by the state is not a certain amount of content, but a certain amount of time. What's required is 120 hours of study time in algebra. That's what's required. It's a time requirement. That's why in a modern high school, you can have honors students putting in 120 hours in the highest level classes, and you can have level 3 students, which we used to call the Bobo classes. You can have kids down there barely doing anything, but they both get credit for the course and they both get the diploma because they satisfied the state's actual requirement, which was that they put in time in the subject. Not that they complete some objective content material, but that they satisfy the time requirement. 120 hours for algebra. If you think that the school year is 180 days, 120 hours would be 40 minutes per school day. That's what the state actually requires. If you do more than that, that's your own choice. That's where modern families go wrong. So in the academy, I provide students with that work to do in our high school program, and they often struggle because they try to do more than is required of them, and they don't submit assignments because they're trying to get it perfect, and they retake tests because they want to get 100%. But this is high school requirement. This is a high school requirement. There's no obligation to get highest scores. In fact, you could give your child an A so long as he completes the time requirement for the course. Just like a student in a modern school would get an A by simply attending school and completing whatever was required at his level, not at some absolute level, but at his level. So we provide that, and what I see is students, they think that there's something virtuous about going above and beyond and doing more and getting, and for high school studies, for compulsory education requirements, there's no reward for doing more. And this is what homeschool families have to stop doing. They have to stop doing more of the compulsory requirements because doing more is not required, it's not rewarded, and it's done at the expense of more important studies, which are being neglected. Anytime we see a student blowing up into calculus in high school, we have to ask, why? Why are you doing that? And what studies are you neglecting in order to do that? That's what we should be asking, because significant studies that are important for a 16, 17, 18-year-old student are being neglected so that a kid can go into calculus, which is required by no one in high school. So these are the issues, and this is where I think homeschool parents need help. You have to avoid allowing yourself to be led by your own anxiety and by misleading people in homeschool circles to do more of compulsory education requirements than you're actually responsible to do. And you have to give the time and attention to the loftier subjects, to real classical Catholic studies that will be crowded out if you go too far in compulsory modern studies. And finding that balance is very difficult for homeschool parents, mainly because they don't even know what classical Catholic studies consist of. And it's just easy to slide mindlessly into a K-12 program and just spend all of your time working on modern education standards. But that has to be avoided. Now, like I said, the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is the only place that allows homeschool families to do this and to do it affordably and easily. We've already laid out the whole classical Catholic curriculum and made it available online, affordably, in a format that the kids can actually enjoy and study with. And we've also built into our program those modern high school courses and requirements, modern studies like modern arithmetic and things like that, that allow the kids to satisfy modern requirements, but to do so in an efficient way, rather than letting those things run out of control. So, to get back to the principle, which is what I want to leave you with, Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and no more, so that you can give to God what is God's and no less. I hope that's helpful. If you'd like to talk more about this, just get in touch with me. You can do so by visiting the website at classicalliberalarts.com, by writing to me by email at mail@classicalliberalarts.com, or you can text or call me by phone. It's 980-699-5575, 980-699-5575. So I hope that that's helpful. Remember, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and nothing more. Give to God what is God's and nothing less. God bless.